Hi everyone. In our last video, we saw how easy it is to load your data regardless of its original shape as is and get it into the MarkLogic Data Hub so that you can begin to discover and use that data. In this video, we're going to look at the concept of modeling that data. So in this video, we're going to see how to create an entity model and define the key properties of data for that entity that will power how our business users consume that data via the services that we deliver. So let's take a look at how it's done. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is get logged into Hub Central. And from the Data Hub Central interface, let's then click on Model. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new entity to represent customer data for our project. So we'll click the Add button here and we'll call this entity Customer. And we'll give that a description. So let's create that customer entity, and then we'll start to add properties to define the key pieces of data that we want to represent within that entity. So from the customer entity here, let's click Add Property. And the first property that we're going to create, let's call it the ID. And this is going to be representative of the primary key from where this data came from. And so let's reference that as a string. And when it asks us whether or not this is an identifier, let's say yes, because that will then describe this as being a primary key, and it will enforce that there's only one unique value per customer entity in our database. So for allow multiple values and PII, or personally identifiable information, let's leave those settings as is. And we don't need to add any sort or faceting on this. The sorting and the faceting, if we turn those on, that will enable our data analysts using the Data Hub Explorer tool to constrain result sets based on a certain property. So for certain properties, we will want to turn on sort and facet capabilities, but not for the ID. So let's go ahead and click Add here and create that first property for our customer entity. Now we're going to repeat this for some other key data properties that represent information about customers. So let's add another property. And this one let's call given name. This will represent a customer's first name. And for type, let's set that to string. We'll keep all the defaults here, except under configuration options, let's click sort. That will allow our business analyst user to sort based on a person's name within the Data Hub Explorer interface. So let's go ahead and click Add. Next, let's add another property, this time representing the customer's surname or last name. This is also a string, and let's leave all the defaults, but again, let's give them sort capability on this data. So we'll click Sort and then click Add. Next, let's create a property here for birth year. So we'll call this one birth year. And note that as I name these properties, I'm using camel case because I know that these are going to be modeled in a JSON data model, and that eventually when I develop services against these, I'll be writing JavaScript code. And so I'm just sticking to some standards that we typically adhere to in JavaScript and JSON. All right, for the data type here, let's set this to integer, and this is going to contain the 4-digit year that a customer was born. Given the requirements that our business analyst has given us, we know that they want to be able to constrain result sets based on the decade that a customer was born. So that might be from 1970 to 1980. So we want to give them the ability to facet on this data property. That will allow them to constrain it to certain ranges. And let's also give them the ability to sort based on this data property. Okay, let's go ahead and add the birth year. Next up, let's create a property that represents the entire Social Security number or tax ID for a customer. So let's call this SSN complete. And this is going to be a string. And the reason it's a string is because some representations of the Social Security number might have dash characters in it, some might have spaces, some might just be 9 numbers. We're going to call it a string so we can deal with all of those. We're also going to select PII here in the configuration options, and that stands for personally identifiable information. By defining it as PII in our entity model, we will restrict access to this data property to only certain users who have a role that enables them to read PII. So we are protecting that information. Let's go ahead and click Add here to create that property. Next, let's create a property that we're going to call SSN short. And the concept here is that we are protecting access to the full SSN because not everyone needs to be able to see that. However, some people might need to be able to validate a customer's identity by looking at, let's say, the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. Imagine those types of scenarios where you call in for customer support and they say, hey, can you let me know the last 4 digits of your SSN and your phone number so we can validate your identity? You would imagine that that person on the other end of the line has only the ability to see those last 4 digits and not the entire thing. That's the kind of approach we want to implement here. So the type for this property is going to be a string, and we'll leave all those defaults and then go ahead and click Add. Next up, let's create another property. This one we're going to call billing address. And for the property type, we're going to create what is called a structured type. Now, a structured type is nice in that it allows us to create nested or hierarchical property and data models. It also lets us reuse these structured types. So there might be many entities in our data hub that have a need to represent address data. You might have a customer entity like this one, as well as a vendor entity, for example. And both need to represent an address in a consistent way. So by creating this new structured type, we'll be able to reuse this model that we build for the address. So let's call this structured type that we're creating simply address. We'll go ahead and click Add there. And then we'll leave the defaults and click the Add button here. Now that we've created this structured type, you can see that when we scroll through our entity model, it is nested. And we could expand that, but there is no definition yet for what this should contain. So what we're going to do is for this structured type that we created in a property name called billing address, we're going to click the little plus button here to add properties to the address structured type that we created. And the first property that we're going to create is going to call the street address, or we'll just simply call it street, and we'll define that as a string, and we'll leave all the defaults. So go ahead and click Add. Next, we're going to create a property for city. So we'll call this city. That's also a string, and we'll leave the defaults and click Add. Next, let's create a property here to represent the state. So we'll call this property state. That's also a string, and we'll leave the defaults and click Add. Next, in our address structured type, let's create a property called zip. And we'll set that to be a string as well, in case we are a global data set where we've got different zip codes from different companies that might contain alphas as well as numerics, or zips that might have formatting characters like dashes or spaces. All right, let's go ahead and click Add for that zip property. Next, we've got all the billing address defined now. So what we're going to do is go back to creating properties within our employee or our customer entity. So up here, let's click that Add Property button again. And now within that customer entity, let's create another property that we're going to call Policies. So we'll call that Policies. And this is also going to be a structured type because a customer might have many insurance policy types with Sunrise. For example, both a home and an auto policy. So just like we did with the billing address, we're going to set the type to be a structured type, and we will create a new structured property type. And we're going to call this new structured property type policy. Go ahead and click the Add button. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at these options that we've got here. For allow multiple values, this time we want to set that equal to yes. And the reason for that is because this should be able to contain an array of policy types. For that same example where a customer has a home, an auto, or a boat, or some other type of policy with Sunrise Insurance, we'll be able to reflect all of those policies here. So go ahead and click Add. Now let's add properties to this structured type that we've just created. So we'll click the plus button down here underneath that policies property. And the first property that we'll create, we're going to call policy type. So this would be like home or auto, and that would be a string, and we'll leave all the rest as the defaults. So we'll go ahead and add that. Next, let's create a property called policy number. And this is also going to be a string, and we'll leave all the remaining settings as their defaults. Next, let's create a property called policy zip. This will be the zip code for the policy. So for example, if the home is in a certain location, this would be the zip code of the home. And we'll set this to be a string. Go ahead and click Add here. We now have configured all of these properties, including two structured properties, one for billing address and one for policies. This represents our customer entity model, and it's this entity model that we will work towards as we curate our data so that all the different shapes of customer data that we've loaded will get mapped and mastered to this entity model. So what we want to do here before we leave Hub Central is save this. So let's go ahead and click the Save All button up here. And when asked to confirm, let's go ahead and say yes. Once you've double-checked all your entity model settings and saved it, you've completed this step. And next, we'll take a look at data curation so that we can take those raw data sources that we loaded as is and begin mapping those properties to this defined entity model that we have created.